So, the scripture we are looking at as we are ushered into this conversation is from Mark 3, verse 14 to 15. And what we're really trying to do is to look at Jesus' example on the topic that we're tackling. So, I'm really excited about what this is leading us into. Let's read from Mark. It says, "As he appointed 12, whom he also named apostles, so that they might be with him and he might send them out to preach and have authority to cast out demons." Just looking at how Jesus went about his first group of leaders and how he's called them to walk with him, follow him, and also incorporated and integrated the strategy of raising them in the work that they're doing. And I'm just so grateful that we've got Malcolm here who's studied this and who's walked the walk and has really devoted his time to learn more from Jesus's example. And he's here today to teach us some of his findings and deep thinking. Malcolm is the founder and the executive director of LeaderSource. He's got a PhD in the field of organizational leadership, worked with Christian leaders in many nations. He's traveled. He's just come back from a month of traveling, and he's almost touched every continent in his travels. And so he's walked with leaders for over 30 years in many different nations and written over 40 books. I thought I made a mistake, but Malcolm, is that correct?
No, it's not correct. It's more like 50.
Oh, wow. So there's so much to learn from. So much of Malcolm's knowledge that's out there, and it's such a privilege to have you here with us live today, Malcolm. And this is all fantastic, but what really inspired me most in connecting with you leading into the session is how your passion for leaders and your heart for leaders is really an overflow from your unity with Christ and your deep close walking with him, understanding, or at least trying to understand, his calling upon our lives and what he's calling for us as leaders to do. I've learned so much from you just in the few engagements, and so I'm very excited for other leaders to also learn from you. So thank you for being here and for being so generous with your time and your knowledge.
It's a great privilege, Nina, and thank you and Ian and the rest of the team there at 54 for granting me the opportunity to be with you all. And greetings, everyone. Great to see you all. Really a privilege to be with you.
Thank you, Malcolm. So I'm just going to jump into the tough questions, if that's okay. I know you can handle all of it. As we've prepared for this, we've spoken about Jesus' example of developing leaders and how we today have actually started separating daily work from raising leaders. We've even seen that in some of the responses, and we've possibly made the act of developing leaders a really heavy thing, a big task, and we send leaders away to be developed elsewhere. But you've shared some really profound insights as we've prepared for this. Could you tell us a bit more of what you see in the example of Jesus that we perhaps have unlearned or drifted from a bit?
Nina, I love the question because that's exactly where we should be looking to understand what leadership is, what a leader is, what a healthy leader is, what leaders do, and in particular here, the vision of leadership succession and leader development. One of the things that it's a little change of thinking for us is to recognize that the Gospels actually are our textbook on leader development and succession. Often we think, well, the Gospels, hey, there's good moral lessons and good teaching, and we can get stories to preach a sermon on Sunday and this sort of thing. All of that's great. But fundamentally, the Gospels show us how Jesus built leaders. And we see, first of all, his vision for building leaders. Jesus came to the world at a time when it was dark. And in many ways, it was darker than the world in which we live today. Because right now, the world is very dark, but there are how many billion believers Yeah. So we're all carrying this and sharing this and working hard together to bring change. But when Jesus came to the world, it was dark and it was only him. So he had this massive task ahead of him to establish his church. Remember, I will build my church, his eternal vision and purpose. But then how did he do that? What we try to do typically when we see the size of the need and the crisis, typically what we do is we try to do something big. Of course, big need, we have to have a big response to that need, but that's not what Jesus did. He did something really small, but really, really deep. He identified a few, the next generation, and then he invested the next 3 years of his life in them. And so, one of the big things that I want to say is that more than just building leaders, Jesus shaped a culture of leader development and succession. If we'll see him as the older leader and then his disciples as basically the next generation of leaders, I think that's perfectly legitimate. He was about to turn his entire plan for the future of the world over to them in 3 years. So they were his successors. And Jesus invested in a few. He built them really well. He built a beautiful culture of leader development, a culture of succession. And then after he left, the disciples just kept doing it. They perpetuated not a form, but a culture, shared beliefs, values, attitudes, actions, language, priorities, everything that a culture is. They perpetuated the culture. They had been built in that culture really well. They weren't perfect. Obviously, we saw some problems in, the book of Acts and the letters and so forth, but they were healthy. Jesus built their lives. And they then continued to build the next generation of leaders the same way. And the amazing thing is, they did it unconsciously. Today, we have models and, cool frameworks, and all of that's great. But Jesus didn't do that. And the early disciples did not do that. They just did it unconsciously, doing the same thing that they had seen Jesus do with them. It's really beautiful. Let me mention a couple of the specific characteristics of this culture that Jesus built.
Mm.
Firstly, um, one of the realities of leader development is that leaders are built in community. And it's a pity if our leader development efforts become like this individualized thing where we're just building a bunch of individuals so that they will do well in God. That isn't what Jesus did. He always interacted with the group. He built a community. He built a culture within that community. And so then all of these beautiful things happened very naturally and organically in that community. There was conflict, there was challenge, there were amazing encounters with God. He gave the community a variety of assignments. Sometimes they succeeded, sometimes they failed. All of it is an opportunity for learning and for growth. In the community, the disciples learned accountability. In the community, as they saw Jesus' example, the disciples learned the deep reality of spiritual friendship and commitment to one another. They learned accountability, they learned support, they learned caring, they learned correction. Many times they learned harsh rebukes from the Lord Jesus. And all of it was this beautiful, complex, not complicated, but complex, a number of things all working together in a very beautiful way to create a transformational environment. Secondly, a really big idea is that Jesus integrated the work of the ministry into his leader development strategy and work. What we have done, and I don't mean this as a criticism of anyone, but let's face the reality, dear friends, that we have spent centuries disconnecting the work of Christian ministry organizations and of churches, the work that we do from the building of the next generation. We say, hey, I can't build the next generation. I'm too busy. I don't know how. I don't have a doctorate in educational psychology. So I don't have a library with 50,000 books. And so how can I possibly build leaders? And so we've given that over to the experts over there. We literally disconnect the emerging leaders from their own transformational community. But Jesus did it in the community, and he integrated the ministry work with the building of leaders, with the building of his successors. He did it all at the same time, and it's beautiful. And once you recognize that, you will see it everywhere in the Gospels. It's everywhere. And see, one of the problems that leaders have today, and I hear this a lot from leaders when people like us show up and we say, dear local leader, one of your primary responsibilities is to build the next generation of leaders. And they say, oh, I can't possibly do that. I'm already doing 80 different things. And now you're giving me number 81 to kind of stick on the top. It's going to just collapse the whole thing. It's too much. I don't have time. But it's not number 81. It's a different lens through which you view what you're already doing. You see? So every time Jesus was about to do ministry work, he thought, how do I build the next generation? How do I nurture a culture of succession as I'm building them, as I'm doing the work itself, the frontline ministry work? So, for example, real simple examples, he sees people who need to be healed. And of course, he heals many, but he also sends his disciples to do it. There's the need for expansion into new villages. And of course, he goes into new areas, but he also sends the disciples to do it. When he is going to do something himself, he makes sure they're with him, because it's as they look at him, as they watch him, as they're with him. And we just read that in Mark 3. He called them number one, dear friends. He called them to be with him. And they walked with him through all of the stuff, through all of the challenges and the beauty of the work and the glory and the fruitfulness and the effectiveness and the transformed lives and all the glorious things they saw, but also the pain. They were there when he went through the rejection, and he watched them interact. They watched him interact with the Pharisees. Ultimately, they watched him die the terrible rejection and death of the cross. Wow, that's where leaders are built. They're built in the middle. They're built in the middle of doing the stuff. So if you embrace this and this vision of integrating again leader development work with the actual ministry that you are doing, all of a sudden you will see transformational opportunities everywhere. And so it won't be number 81 that I've got, all right, now I've got to figure out, what to do, and I've got to create some courses, and I've got to teach them Greek and Hebrew, or, whatever you think you need to do. But instead, you will have this very simple, organic way of building the next generation, through which will come a very natural succession. And so shaping this culture will be the natural daily life of your ministry organization. It's a really cool way to think.
So good, Malcolm. Yeah, there's so much in that to dig into. I'm going to try structure all the follow-up questions that I've got. I'm going to double click on that last bit that you said, that it is about building this culture. That makes me think of one of the paradigm shifts you mentioned, that it's an ongoing integrated piece of work, not a once-off. Could you tell us a little bit more of how that is different, to not think about succession as this event that you work towards, but how what is the difference between it being an event and it being a culture?
Yeah, that's a great question, Nina. Thank you. Yeah, that's one of our paradigm shifts, that succession is a culture. It's not an event. Often we think about succession as an event, that it's this time, and of course there will be specific events that occur related to succession, particularly when we're talking the senior leadership of your ministry. But if we think, please let's think more broadly for a moment about succession. That succession is a continuous process. It's a lifestyle. It's not just the handing over of the power, of the baton. And I know that that's probably the most used metaphor for generational succession, is the idea of the passing of the baton. It's not one that I use, and I recognize there is a time when that happens. I'm not criticizing that metaphor, but it's not one that I use, because I want to promote a broader understanding of a culture of succession. And if I see it as the passing of baton, then at this moment, I've got it. I've got all of that baton. I've got all of that power. I've got all of the responsibility. And now I touch you just for a little bit, and then I hand that over. So we're fundamentally seeing succession related to power and position, which it does have that aspect, but that's not primarily what succession involves. And so when we recognize the broader meaning of succession, that it is a sharing of life, of treasure from one generation to the next, wow, then we see that actually we're holding hands for a long period of time, where the older generation is intentionally investing in the next generation, building the next generation. Yeah, this is our first paradigm shift. Yeah, that succession is
Yeah.
yeah, succession is not just about position and power. That's usually how people think about succession. Who's in charge? And then we have the inevitable wrestling matches between those who have the power and the next generation who, when are you going to trust us? When are you going to, empower us? And so it becomes this arm wrestling match until finally the older leader dies or retires or moves on. And then all of a sudden, the next generation now come into power. And then they so many times, sadly, have to figure everything out again from the ground up. What I recommend instead is understanding succession as an ongoing culture involving the passing of treasure. And then we see that succession occurs over a period of time, where we are walking, older generation and younger generation taking primary responsibility for the ongoing daily work, but they're not doing it by themselves. The older generation is walking with them, committed to them, empowering them, supporting them, holding them accountable, bringing them correction when necessary, and so forth. And so this way, it becomes a culture of succession, not just an event of succession. So what I'm saying here is that leader development is not just limited to a particular program, to a particular piece. Succession is not just limited to a particular narrow, just several people, but broadly, the older generation as a whole in the organization is intentionally, on a daily basis, taking responsibility to build the lives of the next generation. And this way, succession is this ongoing culture, not just an event. And that's what Jesus did. From day one, he built the next generation. From day one, this is what everything he thought is what I'm doing today. How will this contribute to the building of these guys? That's what he did, dear friends. It wasn't like, well, I'm super busy with all of this stuff, but on Thursday afternoon at 2 o'clock, I've got my 2-hour session with my designated successor. And so, that's my time for which that's a whole lot better than nothing, to do that. But even better yet is when we're nurturing the culture.
That's so good, Malcolm. You mentioned, if you used words like build into, and how wonderful it is if we in our organizations and in our community are the ones that build the next generation. Could you tell us a bit more of what is the significance of the organization itself investing into the next generation of leaders, as opposed to those leaders learning skills and being developed elsewhere? What is the beauty in it happening in the community?
Yeah. Well, look, Nina, and that brings us back to another paradigm shift, and that is that succession primarily involves treasure, issues of life, divine life, where the beautiful things that God has done in the older generation are passed on. So it's not just who's in charge, who's got the power, who's got the position, but succession then intentionally, consciously becomes a passing of life, of treasure. See, the older generation, many times I've talked with leaders, and we will have multiple generations in the one room, say of a large church planting network or something, and I'll say, dear younger generation, look at your spiritual mothers and fathers here. Look at the older generation. They are your treasure. Their lives are your treasure. Wow. I remember one time a young man in Asia jumped up in the middle and he said to the older generation, please, we want your life. Your life. That's what Jesus gave his next generation. That was his culture of succession, a giving of life, not just the right knowledge and the right skills, which of course they need. But the older generation must come alongside the next generation to nurture integrity, to nurture dependence on God, faith in God, courage to do the big ventures in God, vision for their nation, vision for the nations, humility, servanthood, deep prayer. These are actually the issues of succession. And it's a pity when we think too in a way that's too narrow about succession, when we see it more as like typically in corporations, the way succession planning is done is that we identify the next in the years to come. What are the competencies that my successors will need? We revolve it around competencies, and then we have identified a few who we think might be the coming senior leaders, and then we invest in them to make sure we're building those competencies to prepare them for the future. All of that is fantastic and is way better than no succession planning at all, which is what happens in most Christian organizations, sadly. So that's way better. I'm not criticizing that, but I'm saying, could we go even further than that, where it's not just the senior leaders who are focusing on building the next generation, but all of the older generation as a whole. And we're not just building the next generation in their knowledge and skills, we're building their lives. Wow, we're passing treasure. And when we do that, we will see that a lot of the issues that are typically issues of conflict between the generations will be greatly helped, because usually conflict between the generations revolves around strategies, forms, and structures. The older generation, they're kind of set, here's what worked for us, these strategies, ministry forms, structures, and they tend to want to see those things perpetuated. But at the same time, the younger generation is saying, hey, we live in a new world. Everything is like totally different, bro, from when you grew up, and we're dying here. We're no longer relevant. Haven't you noticed that? We're no longer having that same impact. We need to challenge the strategies, forms, and structures. So I remember one time I was with the leaders of a large ministry in Asia, and we had hundreds of leaders there, the older generation and then the next generation. And I asked them, dear older generation, think of everything that God has done in you, everything that he's built in you, the treasure that he has given you. Think of that. You can't give everything to the next generation because it's taken you a lifetime, right? So prioritize here. What do you really want to give them? Young people, next generation, look at your spiritual mothers and fathers, your treasure. What do you want to learn from them? What do you want them to give you? What do you want to receive? And so they thought about this and talked, and then we wrote it on 2 whiteboards. What the older generation wants to give, what the next generation wants to receive, and guess what in those 2 lists? Guess
Please
what?
tell us.
Huh?
Please tell us.
Well, number 1, it was the same. The
No
older
way.
generation wants to give the same stuff as the next generation wants to receive. That was our first insight. The second insight, guess what? Everything on both boards revolved around issues of life.
Sure.
Servanthood, prayer, dependence on God, vision for the nation, willingness to suffer, humility, accountability, love for the word of God. I mean, it's all this beautiful stuff. And so then my question to them is, dear friends, the stuff the older generation wants to give is exactly the same as what the next generation wants to receive. And it's all issues of life. Why then are we fighting between the generations? And it's this aha moment. The older generation wept. The younger generation wept. They both wept. And then representatives of each of the generations stood up and apologized. Older generation apologized for not empowering, for not trusting, for not giving away, for not investing in the lives of the next generation. Next generation apologized to their mothers and fathers for fighting with them, for, just this constant wrestling match that we so often see. So it changes the discussion away from when am I going to give you power? When am I going to receive power? To today, I'm doing whatever I can to build your life while we accomplish the ministry work, using that as the opportunity to build your life, because that's where life transformation and maturity occurs. So fundamentally, let's shift the discussion, if we may, from succession being power, authority, position, and it does mean those things. I don't want to discard that, but can we have a broader way of conceptualizing this? And then if we have this broader flow of life and treasure, which is easier said than done, but it can be done, then that becomes a beautiful place for a much more natural and much more beneficial transfer of the power and the position and the baton when it needs to be.
Wow, that is incredible, Malcolm. So am I hearing correctly that the things about strategy and building competencies, there's a place for that and it is important, but primarily the focus when we think about raising and developing leaders, and we kind of get the sense of it's overwhelming, there's so much that we need to do, actually just to simplify it to teaching what it means to walk closely with Jesus, imparting that vision for the ministry. And that's why it's so important for the ministry leaders and community to do that for the next generation, because they get the vision. They've done that. It's imparting that treasure.
Yes. And Nina, imagine the older generation when they have this vision, that they're not just trying to do the ministry work, which typically Christian leaders all over the world, that's what they're doing. They do the work, the ministry work, and they should be doing that. But there's a change of thinking here, so that along with doing the ministry work, I'm doing what Jesus did, and I'm integrating building the next generation. What if we have the older generation as a generation, not just 1 or 2, but the older generation building the next generation, not just 1 or 2, and doing it daily through an organic life transformational process. And this can be done. It sounds, perhaps it sounds complicated. It's really not. Also, let me mention on the subject of competencies that we have to go a little deeper there. Competencies are often seen as like knowledge and skills. And yes, of course, knowledge and skills, but deeper than that, the capacity to think. That's what the next generation needs to be nurtured in. The capacity to act so that they're able to make decisions. They're able to negotiate. They're thinking holistically. They're thinking interdependently. I think Ian mentioned listening before. This is one of the biggest things all over the world leaders do not do, is listening. Well, we need to nurture this in the next generation. So thinking interdependently, thinking holistically, passion for the highest, the fundamental growth orientation where we're looking to God for what can he do, what are his plans and purposes, rather than being limited by our own narrowness of purpose. All of these things, the capacities to think and act, that's a beautiful, really rich world that we can dive into.
Amazing. Malcolm, could you tell us a bit more what you mean when you say, what if it's not just one or two, the senior leaders? What if it's the entire generation, handing it over to the next generation, and the entire younger generation leaning into the older generation? What does that practically mean for us, and for the leaders on this call in their organizations?
Yeah, first of all, there are some discussions that you need to have in your ministry related to the vision for the future, related to how you think about succession, what succession means to you. That's where I would begin in looking, like, again, most ministries around the world do not do anything much related to succession, and that's why it's this like last minute crisis, that so say I'm an older leader, which I am, and I turn 64, and then I'm about to turn 65 next year. I'm going to retire. Oh, I better do something about succession, and it's this last minute thing. I got to identify someone, and how do I build their life? Quick call, and so then you're calling in the consultants and try. It's like, guys, it's a whole different way of doing it, and it's, by the way, it's in the New Testament. is how to literally, it's there in the Gospels, it's there in the early church, in the book of Acts and the letters. It's all there. That's our textbook on succession. So first of all, be thinking through these changes of thinking, that it is the passing of treasure, not just position and power, that it is a culture, not just an event. And then learn some simple frameworks. And we've got some of these frameworks. Please go to 54 collective 50, you have to spell it out, 54collective.com. Sign up if you haven't already done that. Everyone, please, here, dear friends. And your first responsibility, here's your first assignment. You need to go through all my stuff on there, okay? Assignment number 2, then go through everybody else's stuff. I mean, that's cool too. That's great. I love the vision of 54. It's fantastic, and they're really it's a beautiful resource. So please go through that, and I share some specific models on how to actually do this. That will give you a good taste of this. And then if you want, head to our website, LeaderSource.org. We have 1,000 resources there, individual resources that are free to download, everything related to leaders and leader development and leadership and succession and so forth. So there are tons of resources there, but it's primarily, Nina, it's how we think about this, and really expanding our way of thinking to embrace a more biblical approach.
Great, Malcolm. So if there's some organizations who's in a culture where they might be the first generation of leaders, and they are young leaders, they are probably within that bracket of the young leaders, not the mothers and fathers.
Yeah.
How do they go about finding the spiritual mothers and fathers, the older generation who would have imparted this treasure to them? When we talk about that, it's multi-generational. Or if it's just the older generation, they don't have the younger generation, where do we start with that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Nina. And God has given us as a ministry the great privilege of working in many parts of the world where it is a first generation uh, church, first generation believers. And so there are very few older generation to invest in their lives. And then there are also countries where there are lots of older generation, but they don't know how to do this, you know. But to come back to the ones who just don't have the older generation in the first place, my question is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? What do you think, everyone? Which came first? And there is a right answer to this. This is not either or. Nah. So there is a right answer. Someone says the chicken. All right, Nina,
Who
nice.
knew?
That says chicken. All right, we're getting some votes for chicken here. Oh, we've got some eggs from Nigeria. Thank you, Chaga. We've got some chicken from India. So, okay, that's fine. Here's the answer. This is the right answer to that question. Which came first,
Very
the chicken or
confident.
the egg? Which one do you have? If you've got the chicken, that chicken comes first. If you've got the egg, that's what comes first. In other words, it's never going to be perfect. Use what you have and figure out how to get what you need. And when we think about leader development, not as an academic process, but not only as an academic process, but fundamentally as the building of life, and recognizing that this is not just through teaching, but it is through spiritual dynamics, through relationships, through experiences, and then, of course, through teaching. When you look at those four big ways that life is formed, then you see all kinds of opportunities that you can connect with. Again, I get asked this a lot, and I say, look, guys, don't think about what you don't have. Think about what you do have. Think about what you can get. Who can you connect with? Where can you find these kinds of transformational opportunities? Because God is not limited. He's not sitting in heaven and, going, oh no, what am I going to do about the church in this country because there's no older generation? It's okay. Look to him, trust him, and he will open up a path for you to find a deeper place of life transformation and the beautiful building of the next generation in a culture of generational succession.
That is such an equipping perspective. Thank you so much, Malcolm. I want to really give a chance to some of the leaders. I think there's a lot of questions, and I see the chat really being very active. So, Ian, have we got a few questions for Malcolm from the leaders?
We do. My question is, how did you learn to talk with your hands so much, Malcolm? You're amazing. It's just really exciting. We love it. Tim, no, but seriously, Tim asked the question, what's the difference between disciple making and leadership development?
Oh, great. Okay. Let me give you a quick answer to that. Think about our 5C model, if I could, because it will give you just a very simple and very robust way of, because every leader must first be a disciple. But every disciple will not necessarily be an organizational leader. Of course, every disciple will be a leader in different ways. The parents are the leaders at home. You'll be a leader in your job. You'll be a leader among your friends, and and all of this. But organizational leader won't be for every single disciple. In the 5C model, there are 5 areas of the healthy leader. This is on the 54 Collective. Remember your first assignment. Go and do all of my courses, right? You got that? Okay. So this model is on there. 5 elements. Firstly is Christ, union with Christ. Do disciples need that? Well, yes, it's the center of everything in their life. Do leaders need that? Well, yes, Jesus said, apart from the Father, I can do nothing. So how much can we do apart from union with him? Less than nothing. Second is community, accountability, servanthood, all of this beautiful life of community. in the healthy leader's life. Thirdly is character, integrity, holiness, humility. Fourthly, so on the first three, Christ, community, and character, leaders and disciples, exactly the same. Yeah? Union with Christ, accountable and supportive community, and integrity. Exactly the same. No difference between disciple and leader. Yeah? Now let's come to the fourth C, which is calling, the vision and the purpose of the leader. Here is where we start to see a shift. Every disciple has calling, but not every disciple has the specific calling to be an organizational leader. Some do. So in the fourth C, we start to see a distinction, not a separation, because leaders will always be disciples, but a distinction. Then we move to the fifth C, which is competencies. And as I shared, competencies are the capacities to think and act. Here, the basic competencies that a disciple needs are very different from the specific competencies that an organizational leader needs. Is that cool? So the disciples need competencies. See, your calling defines the competencies you need to be able to fulfill that calling. Is that cool?
That's so good.
Yeah, so that's a very simple way of thinking about the distinction. And always remember, though, disciple and leader, it's like the Trinity. They're distinct, but not separate.
Very good. We've got a few more questions. We'll see how many we can get through, and please keep them coming. If we don't get to your question in this session, we've got a WhatsApp community, and we're going to put the questions up there and address them in that community after this. So Abraham raises the question about the fear that leaders have of developing successors. And his question is, how can the biblical principles help us overcome those concerns about losing control or relevance or legacy, and whilst ensuring the continuity and growth of the organization?
That's a great point. There are so many fears that the older generation have. Many of them are legitimate, actually. Often the next generation will recognize the fear in the older generation, but will kind of dismiss it as, well, you're just trying to, keep control. And sometimes that is the case. Not always. There are many legitimate fears that older leaders face. And one of them, I'll mention a couple of them. One of them is, who am I? If I empower the next generation for the last 30, 40, 50 years, this is who I've been, this is what I've been doing. All of a sudden, I'm no longer in charge of the daily operations. Who am I? What are my responsibilities? And that creates a real identity crisis that will cause you trouble if you don't deal with it. It will cause you conflict. The older generation will do things that will undermine the next generation. I mean, they'll say the right things, but then behind the door, they'll kind of undermine and work against in these subtle ways. So you have to deal with that. Who is the older generation? But remember, when we're nurturing a culture of succession, there is ongoing relationship of the older generation to the younger generation. The younger generation have their hands on the work. They're responsible for the work. But the older generation is responsible for the younger generation, for investing in them, for building them, for holding them accountable, for caring for them, for being mothers and fathers for them. And so there is ongoing relevance for them. This is a part of building a healthy culture of succession. Another really big idea that I can relate to very much as an older leader is we're terrified that the next generation is going to discard what we have built, what we have invested our life, the treasure that God has given us, because younger generations tend to do that. And no offense to any younger generation who are on this call, but younger generations tend to do that. They tend to, okay, yeah, that's cool. But, they've always known that. They take it for granted because that's just what they've always seen. And then they're excited by some new trend, the latest fancy thing that comes along, and they just kind of forget all this and charge after that. That's a terrifying thing to an older leader. So the younger generation, this is your job, is to build trust with the older generation, to show them that you do understand the treasure that they have given their lives to build, that you do value this treasure. And look, Jesus did this. Remember how often it says that in order that the scripture might be fulfilled, he said this or did that, right? Remember, again and again, he said, I have fulfilled everything that was in those who have come before me, the prophets and so forth. He was intentional about building on the foundation and the life and the treasure that the older generation had built to that point. Jesus honored the past. And if Jesus honored, if there was ever anyone who could have just showed up and said, hey, I'm here now, forget everything that's gone before, I'm the only thing you need to know. If there was ever anyone who could have done that, it was him. Yes, but he didn't do it. He intentionally knew the legacy, the foundation. He respected it, and he intentionally built upon it. That Paul did the same thing. This is what they did, and we do that. Let me just pick on everyone a little bit here. When you're old, like I am, you've seen this stuff. You see it repeated again and again and again. And every new generation, we line them up and we tell them, you're the key generation. We always do this. You're the great generation. You're the greatest. You're the ones who are going to, da 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 da. And they're like, these kids are like, oh wow, I'm incredible. And we're teaching them to disconnect from the past. Instead of just you're the beginning and the end of everything God's doing on the world. We should be intentionally sharing the past with them, building their lives and ministry on the foundation of the past. It'll be so much healthier. They will do so much better. And then there's this ongoing relationship, nurturing relationship between the generations.
So good. Well, Malcolm, we could have another hour here, but we're running out of time, and sadly, I have this like, oh, I wish we could just keep going, but I also just want to honor the people on the call. This has been incredible. Thank you for just your passion, your heart for this. I have personally, this has shaped my thinking in my own leadership, and I found this incredibly rich and insightful. So thank you for bringing this with such amazing heart and stewardship and passion, and just bringing concepts for us all that have been so wonderful. Thank you, Malcolm.